Well, so far I've been told by an EU official that on the subject of Greenland specifically, all 27 expressed their full support for Denmark. Now, some EU leaders have gone further in this. For instance, President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz came out with strong statements of support for Denmark and saying that this type of intimidation by the United States to try to acquire Greenland, either by coercion or by military invasion, violates all the principles of international law that have been established since World War II. They're hoping for some kind of statement of support like that from Keir Starmer. So far today, they haven't gotten it. So Prime Minister Starmer has just arrived at the Egmont Palace. He's now going to have dinner with the leaders. They're looking for an expression of solidarity. But so far that's been absent from Starmer. He had another opportunity to show full-throated support for Denmark today at that press conference at NATO that we just heard. He declined. Again, speaking to reporters coming into the Egmont Palace, again, he did not. He is, of course, very wary of attracting the ire of Donald Trump, and he's not in an enviable position right now. Donald Trump is clearly trying to play European countries against one another, and particularly to play the UK against the EU. Now, Keir Starmer is saying the UK doesn't have to choose. It can be able to have an equally friendly relationship with both the US and the EU. The reality is, here the rubber is meeting the road right now. Does he express support for Denmark and the principles of territorial integrity, or does he downplay Trump's threats? So far, him and his government ministers have not even been willing to say that it would be bad if the United States invaded the territory of Denmark, the UK's NATO ally. So we'll see at the end of this dinner, do we have some kind of expression of solidarity from Starmer, and maybe even more tangibly, whether they can come to some kind of agreement of cooperation with the UK on the military spending, which has been the big topic of today. Of course, trade inserting itself into this discussion, but really the intention behind calling this informal summit was to talk about EU spending on the military for the first time ever, and how that's going to work and how all of these European countries can massively increase their military spending.
There's something odd, isn't there, about Britain always being in this position about you can't have your cake and eat it. You upset one, you please the other, you please one, you upset the other. And yet, the Financial Times have picked up today that the EU are talking about a defence, quote, coalition of the willing involving Norway and the UK, talking about how actually Keir Starmer could be involved in that. Again, this is something in the pipeline for a while, but how would that play out with NATO?
Yeah, this is very interesting because one of the big consequences of Brexit was that the EU lost one of its only two strong military powers, which is the UK and France. With the UK leaving, the EU for the very first time now is getting involved in defense. And this is obviously because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it's also because of an increasing understanding that they cannot rely solely on the United States and that Europe should have some kind of capacity for self-defense, which it does not have right now. NATO, of course, being led by the United States, is the protectorate under which Europe's security operates. The problem is, now that the EU is establishing this defense fund and getting involved in military affairs for the first time, without the UK, it's not very credible. So they really need the UK's cooperation there in something that is outside of NATO. And this has always been the big concern of people in the UK, people in Eastern Europe, and people in Washington, saying that any EU involvement in military affairs would undermine NATO. Well, now people are saying, well, NATO isn't all that reliable anymore with Donald Trump threatening to pull the US out, Donald Trump militarily threatening NATO allies, and so there needs to be some kind of European pillar. They need the UK in that. So Keir Starmer, he's been wanting flexibility from the EU in terms of access to the EU single market without having to join the customs union, without having to accept free movement. This may be an area where he could get that, because otherwise the EU has completely ruled it out. But if they can come to some kind of understanding that the UK would join these new defense initiatives, if in exchange for the EU offering some access to the single market without having to sign up to all EU rules, that could be the start for some really fruitful negotiations. But we'll see. So far, the Starmer government has indicated they're not interested in anything like that. What would be interesting if you get this coordination, this cooperation with the UK and Norway. Norway, by the way, is because it has an Arctic coastline. If Denmark loses Greenland, the EU loses all access to the Arctic. Norway The border goes right up to Russia. Sweden and Finland don't have a border with the Arctic. They need Norway in there. If they have that cooperation, the interesting thing is some EU countries would probably be outside of that cooperation because of their constitutional expectations of neutrality, namely Ireland. So lots for them to be discussing tonight over dinner.
Dave, good to talk to you. Nice to see you're in the spirit of the informal summit. Tie off. You just need the jacket behind the shoulder circuit, Tony Blair of the early 2000s. Good to talk to you. Dave Keating, our correspondent in Brussels. Let's go to Washington.